sometimes these things are, we have to deal with these things in the moment, but in training you've also got to be prepared that we can't just be a high pressing team. This is what it looks like in this phase. This is what it looks like in the central phase as a mid block, and this is what it looks like in a low block. So expose them to all and be prepared to be able to change and adapt during the game.
Welcome to Coaching Cards. My name is Megan. I'm joined by Claire and Warren, and today we're going to talk about game state, phases and moments, and I'll kick off the first question. What are game state, phases and moments, and why are they important?
Well, during a game of football, there's obviously you start off at 0-0. Earlier in the game, you could go flat out and really go and attack the team, which at that time, that defending team have got to be really resilient, and they've got to try and stay in the game because they're kind of under the cosh, as football phrase may go.
Yeah, so the game's very transient, isn't it? So, we either have the ball, we don't have the ball, or there's the bit that moves in between, that transitional from attack to defence or defence to attack. So those clarity of those moments need to be really clear in terms of the phases that we're looking at and going at which bit are we in. But that is why, in terms of the game, it's played a specific way, this way all the time, but that's what makes it exciting. That's what makes it enjoyable, why we play and why we do it and enjoy it as coaches as well as players playing the game. Okay,
what can coaches do at training to help players with game state, phases and moments?
I think good examples where we've done is looked at game scenarios, because if you naturally just rely on the games that they play on a weekend, you may not gather those experiences, in particular for youth players. So actually putting those scenarios in front of them, i.e. if they're losing 10 minutes to play, how are you going to play, what's the priorities when you've got the ball, when you haven't got the ball, when you've either won or just lost it. So I think giving them scenario builds in terms of games, so we had game specific sessions.
Yeah, I think some of the things also I like to do is prepare them for the different situations. So you can create those scenarios like you spoke about where you might have one team that's going to defend around the box in that situation and they've got to try and transition quickly to attack, and the other team are trying to build up play. So actually both teams are practicing different scenarios and then can work on it in kind of relate back to the game as well. I think it's just giving them that, like you said, those experiences and those references to go back to and go, well, we've done this in training, so I feel prepared into the match as well.
I think also, another way to look at it, and a certain amount of experience of this as a coach, was looking at the times like a start of a game and the start of the second half period. So when teams were conceding, so at the start of games, teams were cold, the intensity was really, really high. We went after them deliberately to go and score within the first 15 minutes, and all of a sudden then we sort of took it down a notch, and then as soon as half time came, we went after them. As soon as the whistle went for the second half, we went after them, and this was based on basically teams we'd played had conceded goals in those periods. So we said, look, we're going to be a team now and we're going to train at this to be deliberate for the first 15 minutes, high intensity, with and without the ball, and the same in the second half. So that's just another way of training, preparing players for that element.
What can coaches do on a match day to help the team deal with game state, phases and moments?
I think for me, I would see it as kind of breaking it down into three. So talking about before the match and those discussions you're having with the players of what you've practiced in training. So you're kind of recapping that and players are aware of that. I think then you're also using kind of half time as well to kind of look at preparing the players, getting them to talk about it and kind of relating back to training. Because I think for me, if you're practicing it and in a moment of the game, it's the momentums of the other team and going back to, okay, what did we learn in training? What do we need to go back to? And kind of having that reset. And then during the game as well, towards the end, as a coach, looking at, okay, how can I impact the game here? How can I bring on subs to make a difference? How can I look at the team? Where are areas that we can exploit? So yes, as players, obviously they can relate back to practices, but also as a coach on the sideline, you can also make an impact with the subs you make, and we don't really call them subs anymore. We call them kind of impactors or finishers to come on, and it might be we need a bit of pace to get in behind the players, or actually if we're winning the game, do we need to bring in some more defensive minded players to look to kind of restrict and compact through the middle.
Yeah, so I think it's really important about narrative, what you mentioned there about those finishers and those games, but actually making sure that the players are watching where they're going to. So can they provide some analytical support? So are they watching who they're up against? You know, what's their preferred foot? Have they got a skill set? What is it they're good at? What's their strength? But then actually, what have they got to actually either neutralise it, or what can they work on to do it as well? So when they're on the sidelines, what are they doing? How are they supporting the game?
So players can be hijacked emotionally. So you've got a great game plan. Within the first 5 minutes, you're 2-0 down. Straight away, you know, you're on your back foot, you're negative. How am I going to get through that? Or it might be something simple like you're a centre back and you've been told to play out the back, and 2-3 first passes, you've given it away. So now you don't want the ball. So there's those little things there where you've got to kind of control your emotion, regardless of what goes on in the game, to have a clear mindset, to be thinking, this is what I've trained to do, this is what I'm going to do. So it's a two-way thing really, the coach being calm and being able to control his emotions, and the player to be able to get in an emotional state to be able to control the situation as well. So I kind of think they work hand in hand.
Do you think in terms of that bit, when we're working with youth phase into development phase, there's a bit of difficulty than working on their IDP, which is their individual development plan, versus the game that's in front of them? And how do coaches, do we help them balance that out?
So that's where the decision making is going to come in. You know, you can train players as much as you want with technique and all the drills that you do, but the best players make the best decisions. And obviously as a coach, you can't control that. You can give them the tools and help them developing on a training pitch, but as soon as moving things happen, i.e. opposition, everything changes. Once they step over the white line, it's down to the player, even though it's influenced by the manager before, a little bit less during, and obviously after the result's gone. So I think that's the kind of situation you're in. And all I would say is, just from a coach's perspective, is just be as simple and clear with your message as you can. So the player's got a clear understanding as what they need to do, but ultimately it's down to the decision making on the pitch of the player.
In your opinion, can the environment atmosphere have an effect on the players and decision making of individuals and the whole team? And if so, what can coaches do to combat this?
100%. I mean, if you just take a simple one, like everyone goes out with attention in creating the right environment, but you could be, and I'm just looking at the top end, but this is, I suppose, all ages. You've got on a 6-game run where you haven't won. In pre-season, this great environment was created. It was open, honest. You know, everyone it was buy-in from the players. It was ownership from the players. But you've lost these 6 games. Now the doubt has come in. Just try and keep it real. You know, the environment's created for a reason, so that everyone's comfortable, and have that belief that after losing 6 games, that it's going to turn the corner. But think about how what processes are going to turn that corner. So again, mental states before the game are quite important. So having something to reflect back to, come on, in respect of the coach, remember the things that we did. This will help us do X, Y, and Z. Believe in that. But it's easy said, but for the players to believe it, they've got to see it and they've got to live it. So only that win can sometimes turn the corner, but it's the process of getting that win is probably the hardest thing.
In my opinion, I think the environment can definitely affect players' decisions. So if we're talking grassroots football, I think there's a lot of factors that can come into players' decision making. So it could be who they're playing, it could be how many players they have, it could be the parents as well. And I think, you know, especially younger age, they probably can feel very nervous, very anxious what's going on. I think as a coach, how can you support your players? I think it links back to what you said about being calm. If you are showing that you're calm and you're being kind of that role model, kind of making the players feel safe and going, okay, well, the coach isn't like panicking and they're not going around trying to find extra players. They seem to put a bit of trust into us. They seem to give us a lot of positivity. And then that can psychologically kind of help the player go, okay, well, the coach seems okay. The coaches seem all right. So why should I shouldn't be panicking, because I think players do really react off coaches as well and their behaviours.
Yeah, I think adding to that, you speak about the players looking at the coach. I think from the coach's perspective, you probably need to manage the parents, like you said.
Yeah.
Because if it is a top of the table clash, all of a sudden the noise levels goes up. Every parent now is trying to be the coach, you know, trying to influence the players in another way. So, yeah, there's so many different other factors that could affect the kids to make them either more on edge or, you know, less confident, etc.
Love a silent weekend. We did that when we had derby games and we had those important games. That was the weekend I chose for parents not allowed to speak on the sideline. You were allowed to clap and that was it. So there was nothing else said. Frustrated, but what was really important was the education about it as well. So I just explained to parents the why. And I go back to as well, it was an open door, it was very transparent. There's no hidden agenda about it. I'm just like, we want players to make the right decisions on the pitch and want them to make it, not you on the sideline doing X, Y, and Z.
I think also, and I think it goes back to that IDP as well, you can set them players little challenges as well. So if the player is feeling very nervous and anxious about the game and they're focusing on everything else going around them, it could be linking, look, you know, can you try and press that player and can you try and press the closest player? So then they're not thinking about everything that's going on, they're thinking on, well, the coach just wants me to do this, so I'm just going to do that. And when you see the player do it, give them that encouragement, and then little things will happen and little positivity will kind of come through, because the player's not worried about everything else. They're worried about kind of the job that the coach has set as well.
Okay, what advice would you give to coaches to pass on to their players to help them read the game, adapt the game state, phases and moments more effectively?
I think you have to expose them to different ways of playing. So I think kind of when you're planning their curriculum, or you're planning in terms of how that looks, you're not going to cover that in 1 or 2 weeks. That's going to be a real embedded program in terms of right from being foundation to youth phase to through. And if you're lucky enough to, generally most times we keep our groups as we move along and follow them through. But as we embed that within their curriculum, we want to make sure that we're looking at it as being where it's challenged, it's easier, and then when it's actually stretched at points as well. Because I think we need to really expose them to that.
Yeah, I think what you touched on there, you're trying to expose your players to near the game as much as possible in every situation. So, for an example, it could be overloads, or as well, you know, a player's been sent off or a player's got injured and we've got no one to replace them. Okay, well, how as a team do we deal with this? Have we done something in training where we're playing against overload? It could be small-sided, going on to the bigger picture. How do we as a team come together? Because I think you can see with players or even coaches, you know, something happens and we haven't prepared for it. We're like, well, okay, well, what do we do now? The players have never been in this position. So doing that in training as well is really important, because, you know, we understand, you know, if it also depends on the state of the game. Are we winning and we've got one less player? Right, what do we have to do? Can we go back to something we've done in practice where we need to make sure we're nice and compact, or there's a transition and it's an overload? Okay, well, that player, how do we delay them? Looking back to then kind of linking to principles of play a little bit, that you've exposed the players to all those situations, so when they come to it, they can refer back to it as well. Yeah,
I mean, I'm just thinking, like, when you talk about sort of style of play, so you're playing against a team, you've looked at if I'm talking about again at the PDP phase, you've looked at the opposition and what they're going to present. So they're very good at building, and they've got a lot of speed at the top end of the pitch. So historically we've always been a high press team, but we're now going to concede and say, well, you know what, we're going to change our tactics because of this team. We're going to go into a mid block. So there's sometimes you've got to be ready to change to obviously nullify the opposition. Sometimes these things are, you know, we have to deal with these things in the moment, but in training you've also got to be prepared that we can't just be a high pressing team. This is what it looks like in this phase. This is what it looks like in a central phase as a mid block, and this is what it looks like in a low block. So expose them to all and be prepared to be able to change and adapt during the game.
So we have to have different ways of making and playing and why and what we're doing for it. Us as knowing it as coaches, but also them as players on the pitch and why they're doing it, to have that understanding of that. And how does it affect me as a winger? How does it affect me as a centre half? So again, just them understanding that individually who they are, and it is about actually, we use the narrow lens. Football is individuals playing in a team sport, but it's just how those relationships build together, and its simplicities of it. How important is communication on the pitch for adapting to game states and moments? And how can coaches help players improve in this area?
I think communication is important in any situation, not just in game states. I think so there's been a big society change. I think most youngsters now, communication is a real problem on the pitch. Naturally, they just don't talk. So I think from a coach, you've got to be mindful. First of all, you've got to be mindful of that, because it's quite easy to say, come on, if you talk to your right back or your left back as a centre back, you're going to make it easy for yourselves. But so I think once the players understand the reason as to why they need to talk, it's probably easier to kind of sell and to encourage them to talk a little bit more.
It might be something as well within your team or your club that you kind of have agreed terms, agreed what language and communication you use. So the terms of press, what does that mean in your environment, in your team? Because sometimes, and I've seen it, we ask players to talk and communicate, but I don't think they know what to say sometimes. So we ask them, yeah, you've got to talk, we've got to communicate. But sometimes they're like, I don't really know what do I say. So sometimes it might be, okay, actually let's talk about what do these words mean in our environment, and they could look different depending on different ages as well. So it might be, when we're going to hunt the ball, that could be an example for the younger one. So okay, if one of the players shout hunt, then we know, right, we've got to go get the ball. So actually giving the players kind of the ownership as well to agree on a bit of a terminology, it can then help them to know what to say.
I think it's really clear, we're quite clear in terms of there's non-verbal and there's verbal communication as well. So I think we need to be distinct between the two. And non-verbal is generally recommended as the body language, isn't it? So that's the body language that comes from us as the coach and verbally onto the pitch. I think there's a reliance on verbal, where if we're looking at some players and that they might not be able to articulate, which we mentioned that before. So we need to be mindful of that. We'll have some really good articulate kids in there, and they'll be your captains, they'll be your leaders on that. But to develop everyone, giving them some exposure to delivering sessions together. Okay, we're going to take it in turns over this term. You're going to, in pairs or threes, you're going to design a warm-up, and you're going to lead it and coach it. But also give them some exposure to leadership and to chat and to communicate. And again, it's just a skill that needs to be learnt. We can't just expect them to suddenly have it. But we need to be very clear and distinct about those non-verbal communication points and those verbal ones as well. I think how we talk as coaches to players needs to be really important as well. So clear, concise. We may only have short bits of moments to do that, i.e. half time. Who speaks, how we speak, what role we got. If you're lucky enough to be doubling up as coaches, am I speaking about one thing, you're speaking about another, not just repeating what I've said. Knowing the players in front of you, how are you going to communicate to them? And like I said, it might be a tactics board, it might be a verbal conversation.
I also think sort of during game, so during game as a coach, I mean, again, experiencing it as a player and obviously then being a manager or a coach in this situation. So sometimes you hear a lot of managers on the sideline, it's constant commentating, and from a player's perspective, it just becomes noise and you lose the impact from a coach perspective. So if you limit that and say less, when you do make that point, it becomes a real big impact to a player. It's easy said, but that would be the potential way to allow players to be able to go and express themselves and not have to worry about the constant noise on the sideline.
It's a really good point, and I think if you're curious, we can all record ourselves now. So we all got a smartphone, headset, record yourself on a match day. How are you different to that in training? Should it be different? Should it be? We know it's important to players. Players deem the match day important, but our behaviours should be consistent.
Just to add as well, your messages have to also be clear and short before the game and at half time. So, sometimes we can completely overload the players before the game with lots of information. And I think realistically, players switch off after a minute. And at half time, I think also that we talk about that kind of emotional part of the game is, as a coach, talk to your other coach and just have a minute to yourselves to discuss, right, these are the points we're going to talk about. Let the players also have their time as well, because actually it gives players just to kind of have a minute to themselves to go, okay, just need to take a moment, because I think sometimes if you go in quite quickly, you're talking more about emotionally about how the game's gone and not kind of taking a minute delivering those messages. And half the time players know if it's going well, if it's not going well. But then actually as a collective, as a coach and as players, regardless what any age, you can then have a bit more of a conversation about the game. And for me, it's got to be clear and it's got to be quite snappy as well.
I think how and what you leave them with is important as well. I think if you're consistently negative with them, you're going to make them feel like that. So it's important, and particularly, and I know we're definitely in the female game, but I think I've seen it in the boys' game now as well. Like how you make them feel is more important than actually all the knowledge that you can tell in the world to go and do it. But if you make me feel good about myself and we can go have a go about it, I can go do the job and get that done.
And I think just to add to the last bit is the communication you deliver, whatever age or stage you're working with, has to kind of be the same winning or if you're losing or drawing. Because if you're winning and you're really energetic, like this is great, or if you're losing, your body language is a bit downplays, pick up on it. So actually staying consistent and it's a hard thing to do, but definitely something to be really aware of. The players can kind of know, okay, we're still doing our job, we know what we're doing, regardless if we're losing 2-0 at half time or we're winning 2-0 at half time. We're constant and we stay the same. What advice do you have to help coaches with game state, phases and moments when working in different areas of the game?
I think if you wrap it around one word, it would be to stay calm in the moment, because your body language and your voice and your actions can influence others. If you want to go a bit more specific, younger players would need probably a little bit more reassuring and know that they can trust you, because then it allows them to potentially have a little bit more confidence. So regardless, win, lose or draw, that you're always there for them, and they know that, you know, when you're calling their name out, it's more of a support, encouragement, rather than, you know, criticising.
Would I prioritise game state moments with 8-year-olds? Probably not. But I'd be mindful with them about where it needs to sit and fit in later in terms of their development. As we then move into youth phase, into the older one, you know, the training to win, we're probably looking at more game state areas to focus on, more communication support to kind of get them to experience it in different styles, formations, who you're playing against, where you're playing, positions, as they start to kind of have an idea at that point where they're probably going to play in position-wise. The experiences that we're doing, age and stage is definitely important in terms of where we prioritise that and where we are as coaches to that. But also being mindful of actually like the game state of football itself and what they're playing. They're playing a format of the game up until the point they're looking at training to win the game.
To wrap up this discussion, what are your quick fire top tips to help coaches with game state phases and moments?
I think for me is, as a coach, staying calm and going back to trying to control your emotions, even though it can be challenging at times. And I think for me the other one is exposing your players and training to as many different situations as you can, but make the practices real, make them game related, because then players can refer to that and reference back to it.
I think language is important. What narrative, what do you say, so specific and age related as well. Transitions is a big word. Getting an 8-year-old to spell that, never mind say it. So make it relevant and realistic to the words, and actually maybe get the players to come up with that themselves. You know, so make sure that language and behaviour is related to the age and stage that you're working with.
Okay, yeah, I just think getting to know your players, knowing what they can give you, what their deficiencies are, is going to be a real benefit too.